Vespasum parabellum. If you want peace, prepare yourself for war. In the past, the destiny of each town depended not only on its location, climate, and natural resources, but also on how well it was protected. From the time of its foundation, Lviv had a convenient location which always attracted people. The town first appeared among dense forests and high hills. From the west, it was reliably protected by marshes of the Poltva River. These natural fortifications were reinforced by citizens of Lviv with artificial fortifications. The main fortifications which rendered to Lviv the status of a town were the High Castle and the Low Castle. Both castles appeared in the middle of the 13th century at the time of the Galician and Volyn princedom, when Rus was attacked by the Mongol and Tatars. The Rus annals and other chronicles of the 16th, 17th centuries reported that yet before 1256, the Count Leo Danilovich built fortifications on the Zamkova hill, which was much steeper at that time and was situated over the marshy valley of the Poltva River. The fortifications at that time were made of wood and soil. Therefore, 3 years later, following the demand of Han Burundai, Count Leo quite easily dismantled Daniliv and Stizhok and then sent people to dismantle also Lviv. Sometime later, in order to restore the fortifications, Count Leo ordered to quickly build a fortress on the hill, using trees cut down on the site, and encircle the fortress with fences and dense bushes. In the time of military campaigns of Telebu and Nogai, the Tatars stood 2 weeks near Lviv, not daring to start the attack. In 1340, when Lviv was first conquered by the Poles, the King Casimir III burned down the wooden castles of Lviv and Volodymyr. The Poles looted the Count's treasury, stole golden crowns embedded with jewelry, gold-plated throne, precious cross, and burned Lviv's oldest documents. A new castle, now it was built of stone, appeared on the Zamkova hill at the end of the 14th century. It became the residence place for the king's senior. It also was used as a jail. At the time of the revolt organized by Khmelnytsky, the high castle was conquered by the peasant and Cossack troops led by the colonel Krivonos. In the 18th century, when Lviv was occupied by the Swedes, the castle was heavily destroyed, so no one even tried to defend it. When Galicia came under the rule of the Austrian monarchy, the new authorities started dismantling Lviv's fortifications. By the beginning of the 19th century, the larger part of the high castle had been dismantled. The remains of the walls were used for creation of an embankment in honor of the Lublin Union, which aimed at propagating the Polish character of Lviv and Galicia. The Low castle, built at the same time as the High Castle, was originally wooden, but later it was built of stones and bricks. It was the most powerful fortification in the northwest corner of the town. It had stone walls and towers, ditches and channels. It also served as a residence of the king's senior, as a place for the town's and land's courts. Inside there was a palace of the senior, a chapel of St. Catherine with a wooden bell tower, and a house for the priest, rooms for court and archive, jails, a house for the king's guard. The castle was reconstructed and repaired many times. At the end of the 18th century, the castle became half-ruined because of the dampness from the Poltva River. That was the reason why the Austrian authorities finally decided to stop financing of the castle's repairs and dismantled it. The stones and bricks from the castle were used for building of a number of houses. The Lviv's fortifications were getting more and more developed following the development of the military art, namely artillery. The town got encircled with a stone wall, which later was called the Higher Wall. The wall included 17 towers, outside of which there was a ditch with the water running from the Poltva River and an embankment. The towers were divided into craftsmen's shops, those of skinners, soap makers, tinsmiths, sword makers. The craftsmen had to keep their sections in order, manufacture the required ammunition, and protect their sections from enemies. There were only 2 reinforced access gates to the town, the Galician from the south and the Tatars from the north. Later, the second line of defense was created around existing fortifications. The lower wall with 15 basteia, semicircular towers with no roof. The remains of the tower can still be found under the ground. The third line of defense was created in the middle of the 16th century. It represented an embankment with 4 powerful towers, of which only the Powder Tower was preserved till our days. The fortifications were created before each military event. All monasteries located outside the town had own fortifications and weapons. The fortifications of the Bernardine complex, adjacent to the town walls, and the monasteries of St. Lazar, St. Onufri, and Benedictine nunnery have been preserved till our days. The demand for protection of the town was satisfied by two main arsenals. The town's arsenal, situated between the high and low walls, and the royal arsenal. The town's arsenal stored only weapons of the town and workshops, while the royal arsenal stored weapons of the king's guards and the army. However, often it was vice versa. The king often borrowed cannons from the town for military campaigns, forgetting to return the weapons after the war. The town's arsenal had its own smelting house and manufactured cannons which were marked with the Lviv's coat of arms. The arsenal had also a room for execution. Both castles also had their own arsenals. Besides, there were private arsenals of such magnates as Seniavsky, Pototsky, Bavorovsky. The latest fortification of the town is the citadel, built in the 19th century in the times of Austrian rule. In accordance with the military traditions of that time, it had powerful artillery junctions on 4 corner towers, barracks, storages for ammunition, and large underground vaults. For many centuries, the fortifications protected Lviv against enemies' attacks, ensuring that the citizens of all nations and religions live peacefully in the town, and created the masterpieces of architecture, literature, and arts in which we take pride today. Memento Mori. Remember about death. The ritual of burial of the dead is perhaps the first sign of a man's conscience. Before creation of the written records, the necropolises were perhaps the only evidence of the man's history. Through necropolises, one can trace also the history of our city. When making excavations on the cathedral square in Lviv, for instance, their archaeologists found tens of burials. Turned out that about 500 years ago, near the cathedral, there was a cemetery for burial of the Catholics living in Lviv. Sometime earlier, there was an Orthodox church on that place. The archaeological findings from the cathedral square revealed almost sensational information about Lviv of the Rus times. So let's have a look into the world of the dead and pass this knowledge to those who are alive. Let's have a virtual tour of the Lviv cemeteries. Starting from the 15th century, the Lviv nobility created crypts in the cathedral and in the adjacent cemetery. Some of those crypts, such as the chapels of the Campians and the Bohems, have been preserved to our days. The foundation of another such crypt, the Gothic, was recently investigated by the archaeologists, and it was found that the Bohems had a more than 50 meters long underground passage from the chapel to their home. Perhaps they didn't want others to know how often they pray. There was an ancient cemetery also near the Church of the Assumption. While distinguished citizens were buried in the vaults of the Church of the Assumption, for instance, holds the remains of the Cossacks' leader Ivan Pitkova, who was executed on the market square in 1578. It is worth mentioning that starting from the end of the 16th century, the Ukrainians living in Lviv had big problems with burial of the dead. The town council, represented by the Catholics, banned marching through the market square with lit candles and singing. The members of the Assumption Brotherhood were repeatedly fined and imprisoned for the breach of the above decree. The remains of another old cemetery can be found in the yard of the Armenian Cathedral, which is one of the oldest temples in Lviv. According to the Armenian belief, the memory about a man will die only after his name on the tombstone is wiped out under the feet of those alive. That is why the Armenians traditionally put the tombstones from old burials under their feet as a memory of the dead. The Bernardine Cemetery has left for us only a couple of tombstones embedded into the facade and walls of the former Roman Catholic Church of St. Andrew. The temple was considered aristocratic because only nobility was allowed to be buried there. The cemetery adjacent to the church was liquidated at the end of the 18th century. The underground vaults of the Church of St. Andrew were also liquidated at the beginning of the 19th century. So 330 coffins and 73 horse carriages of rotten remains of the dead were transported to the Lychakiv cemetery. The oldest large cemetery located outside the stone walls of Lviv was the Horodotsky cemetery, founded in the mid-17th century. It was a place of last resort for petty bourgeois who lived in the Krakow suburb. But in 1875, this cemetery was closed. Following the order of the town council, the burials of noble and rich people were transported to the Lychakivsky cemetery, while the remaining burials were abandoned and ruined. Soon after, the territory of the cemetery was covered with broken arms and legs of stone statues. Back in 1925, in memory of the coronation of the Dominican icon of the Blessed Virgin, Count Potocki installed a memorable column in the center of the abandoned cemetery. However, the time did not spare it either. The most interesting and valuable cemetery in Lviv, both from the historical and artistic points of view, is the Lychakiv cemetery. The first records about the burials in the suburban village of Lychakiv date back to 1567, when the victims of the plague were buried there. The modern cemetery was founded in the 18th century when the town council issued a decree on liquidation of cemeteries which were inside the town's area. Before long, the Lychakiv cemetery became the main cemetery in Lviv. Its area was significantly enlarged. In the middle of the 19th century, the director of the University Botanical Gardens, Karl Bauer, prepared a layout of the cemetery lanes and planted many valuable trees there. This initiative was taken over by Tit Tchuzhevsky, who divided the cemetery into fields. In 1885, a record book of burials was created. The cemetery at that time occupied the area of 40 hectares. The Lychakiv cemetery soon was considered to be aristocratic because there were transferred the burials of noble people and family crypts from other Lviv cemeteries, which were liquidated in the 19th century. Though in fact the dead of all social ranks were buried there, even homeless, while the suicides were allowed to be buried only near the cemetery walls. The monuments in the Lychakiv cemetery were created by such famous sculptors as Hartman Witwer, Abel Perrier, Anton Schimzer, who is the founder of the famous school and whose tombstones can be found in a number of cemeteries in Europe. The Lychakiv cemetery was one of the first cemeteries to introduce the so-called cemeteries within a cemetery. The cemeteries within a cemetery appeared at the beginning of the 20th century as a place of burial of the Polish rebels, then the soldiers of the Austrian, Russian, German armies killed in the World War I. The Ukrainian military memorial, the Martian Field, as well as the Polish and Soviet military cemeteries appeared in a similar fashion. The Lychakiv cemetery became the place of last resort for many prominent citizens of Galicia. Famous artists and scientists such as Ivan Franko, Markian Shashkevich, Solomia Krushelnitska, Vasil Ivasuk, Anton Schimzer, Stanislav Ludkevich, Alexander Barvinsky are all buried here. Their tombstones represent not merely the memory of the dead, but are the true masterpieces of cemetery sculpture. The chapels and pantheons are considered to be the pearls of cemetery architecture. There are luxurious crypts of Dunin Burkovsky, Bachevsky, Pototsky, as well as many unknown crypts which names were wiped away by the time. The Straysky Cemetery is considered to be the late cemetery. It was founded at the end of the 18th century after adoption of the decree on liquidation of the cemeteries adjacent to churches. Because of its small area, the cemetery was soon occupied and was closed already in 1823. At this very time, a new Straysky cemetery was founded quite far away from Lviv. At first, it occupied the area of only 4 morgues. Therefore, the privilege to have crypts or tombstones there was given only to famous citizens. Also became the place of burial of those who died of cholera. But soon the cemetery became abandoned. The rich began to transfer their burials to the Yanivsky cemetery. The Straysky cemetery became shelter for thieves and tramps. The remains of the abandoned cemetery were destroyed in the middle of the 20th century. The Yanivsky cemetery was founded in 1883 on the suburban sand hills. Unlike the aristocratic Lychaky cemetery, the Yanivsky cemetery originally was a place of last resort mostly for the poor citizens of Lviv, but the noble burials which were transferred there from other cemeteries soon raised the status of Yanivsky cemetery. The Yanivsky cemetery also has its cemeteries in the cemetery. It is a place of burial of the Ukrainian national heroes, soldiers of the Ukrainian Galician army. Among the tombs of ordinary citizens, one can also find those of soldiers and clerical persons. Therefore, the Yanivsky cemetery became a memorial of Lviv, an illustration of its new history. Certain communities in Lviv had their own cemeteries. The old Jewish cemetery was situated within the boundaries of Bazarna, Kleparivska, Rapaporta, Brovarna streets. Originally, it was a place for burial of Karaites who practiced Judaism, but when they moved to Kulikiv and Halich, the cemetery was taken over by the Jews. At the time of the German occupation of Lviv, the cemetery was destroyed. Later, it was transformed into a marketplace, the Krakowski market. In the 19th century, another Jewish cemetery was created near the Yanivsky cemetery. A couple of tombstones have been preserved from the old cemetery. Today, it is actually another cemetery within a cemetery, where the Jewish community buries their dead in accordance with their old traditions. Each person finally ends his/her life journey. The territorial expansion of Lviv and the significant increase of its population in the second half of the 20th century have resulted in creation of new cemeteries. Someday, the new cemeteries will pass to the future generations the history of our times. With this in mind, one has to respect burials of the dead and remember the saying, Memento Mori, remember about death. Hic transit gloria mundi. Thus passes the world's glory. Any kind of art is a mixture of harmony and beauty. If we consider the architecture of Lviv, we will find that palaces not only represent their historical epochs, but also represent the harmony of coexistence of a man and its dwelling. It is a true harmony, because palaces were built not only to provide aesthetic pleasure, but also to provide comfort of living. Lviv, as one of the oldest towns in Galicia, was the place of living for local nobility. There were high and low castles, which were bent down by the Poles in the 14th century. On the market square, there was a palace of an archbishop. The archbishop received the palace as a gift of the Prince Władysław Opolski. The magistrate didn't recognize the archbishop's right to the palace, so the archbishop had to defend his rights at lengthy court proceedings and died before the trial was finished. The Polish kings lived in Lviv. Sometimes they lived here more than in Krakow. In the middle of the 19th century, a new palace was built for the archbishop. It was located on the hill and had an unconventional, semi-secular and semi-sacral design. The Orthodox, Greek Catholic and Armenian hierarchs had their own luxurious palaces in Lviv. Their palaces were not only the centers of religious life, with meetings of religious courts, etc., but also the place for mundane events, such as receptions, balls, etc. According to the contemporaries, the St. George's Palace hosted a jolly and vigorous events organized by the niece of the Catholic Patriarch Józef Szumlański at the beginning of the 18th century. Before his appointment as a high clerical member, Józef Szumlański was a captain of the king's army, a trusted man of the king, and an educated and witty cavalier. Szumlański occupied the clerical post in 1668 in a quite peculiar manner. The king appointed two persons for the top clerical post in Lviv, so to get rid of his competitor, whose name was Swystelnicki, Szumlański took the St. George Monastery by assault. In 1772, the time when Galicia was joined to the Austrian monarchy, Lviv became the capital of a new province. The governor of the new province was lodged in the palace of the Lubomirski. In the 19th century, he moved into another grand palace, which was built in classicism style specifically for him. But archbishops, clerical persons, and kings were not the only persons who built palaces in Lviv. Prosperous patricians, both Catholics and Orthodox, also had palaces in Lviv. In 1580, Constantin Kornakt, an Orthodox Greek who came to Lviv from Crete, bought 6 buildings situated on the market square and transformed them into a majestic palace with 6 windows on the facade. The building was designed by a famous Italian architect, Pietro Barbone. The palace, built with a great taste, is considered to be the best example of the Lviv Renaissance. The time has changed the original appearance of the palace, with each new owner introducing certain changes to suit his taste. The next century, when the palace was owned by the King Jan III Sobieski, it underwent reconstruction. The coat of arms of the Korniaks was chiseled away from the facade, and the image of Janina Sobieski was put above the gate. The real beauty of the palace is its yard, which was called Italian or Venetian. The yard presents a harmonious mixture of severe symmetry and attention to details. It produces an impression that the columns are hanged in the air. The interior of the palace fascinates with its splendor. Each royal hall is peculiar, with its own finishing of walls, floors, and ceiling. But this is not surprising. The palace, in the second half of the 17th century, was the residence of a powerful Polish king, Jan III Sobieski. Another palace, the Palace of Bandinelli, also mesmerizes with its wealth and refinement. The stone portals of doors and windows, unique beauty of halls. This palace is duly called the Pearl of late Renaissance. The latest palace was erected by the Princess Lubomirsky in the eastern side of the market square. The palace was built at the end of the 18th century by transforming two smaller stone houses. In 1772, when Galicia joined the Austrian Empire, the palace became the place of residence of the commander of the Austrian army. Then, the building was taken over by the first governor of Galicia, Count Pergen. At the beginning of the 20th century, the palace was bought by the Prosvita organization. A late Baroque palace for a general of the king's army, Roch Wieniawski, was created almost at the same time. In 1773, like the Lubomirsky Palace, the palace was built on the place of two earlier buildings. The facade of the palace was decorated with the sculptures of Venus and Mars, the symbols of peace and war, and splendid bas-reliefs. Till the end of the 18th century, the norms of the Magdeburg Right prohibited the nobility to have own real estate in the town, which was limited by fortifications. That is why the nobility started to build their houses outside the town. The Jablonovsky family, for instance, appropriated a large plot of church land and built there a palace. However, it was not preserved till our times. The palaces of Count Sheptytsky were situated nearby. Though their palaces were more modest than that of the Yablonovsky, it held out till our days. The Besedetskih Palace is perhaps the only magnate's palace in Lviv. It was founded in 1737 by the president of Lviv, an Italian from Bologna, Carlo Garani. After the death of Garani, the palace was purchased by Antoni Bilski. The palace was reconstructed to receive distinct Baroque features. Since mid-19th, the palace hosted famous Lviv contracts. The palace has witnessed many events. Today, it is awaiting its restoration. The palace of the Pototsky family, which was built at the end of the 19th century, looks as if just transferred from the banks of Loara or the Sena. This grand building, decorated with modeling and bas-reliefs, was erected for a respected Pototsky family. It was designed in the early French classicism style. This palace hosted the reception of the Persian Shah. The balls held there gathered the elite of the Galician nobility, regardless of religion and nationality. The Counts Semensky built their palace sometime earlier, at the beginning of the 19th century. The Lviv architects Levinsky and Wagner designed it in the French Baroque style. The horses above the gates point to the fact that the Count was the chair of the Galician Association of Horse Owners. The association was engaged in horse breeding and horse races. The Empire Palace of Sapir also fascinates with splendor and aristocracy. It integrated new trends in architecture. In the 19th century, it was stylized as Baroque. This is its present look. One of the best examples of the early classicism, the Palace of Didushitsky, was built at the beginning of the 19th century. The Count Volodymyr Didushitsky, a prominent scientist and patron of arts, financed the research and publications on the geography of Galicia. All his life, he collected and investigated flora and fauna. When the palace became too small for his collection, Didushitsky built a separate, much more spacious palace and gave his first palace to the Lviv community. The Lviv palaces were designed by representatives of the famous architectural schools, at the request of such respected Lviv families as Osolinsky, Belsky, Turkul-Kamello, Holuchovsky, Zamoysky. But to really understand Lviv palaces, one needs to visit them and feel the breath of the past. Town Hall is being built in the middle of the square. On top of it, a trumpeter announces midday. According to the historians, for the inhabitants of Lviv in Middle Ages, there were only two main buildings in the town, the church and the town hall. The Ukrainian word ratusha, which means town hall, is derived from the German word Rathaus, which means house of the council. In the middle of the 14th century, Lviv was granted the Magdeburg right, which allowed the town to have its own self-government institutions. Therefore, the council and the court were united into a magistrate. The main building of the magistrate was a town hall. All we know about the original Lviv town hall is that it was burnt down together with all the documents. From 17th to 19th centuries, the town hall tower was octahedral, and it was about 8 meters high. On top of the building, there was a gilded weather vane in the form of a lion. According to the beliefs, the weather vane did not only indicate the wind direction, but it also showed where the danger may come from by throwing itself head first. This move showed the direction of the future threat. The town hall also had an underground jail. Daylight never got there. The prisoners lived in horrible conditions, since cells were flooded with soil waters. The guards, or tsipaki, enforced the order in the prison. The imprisoned could only soothe their lives with alcohol. The Lviv mayor of that time joked that the Lviv jails resembled taverns, because in the morning there was a lot of vodka, and in the evening there was a lot of honey. The medieval town hall had its own secrets, which later became legends. One of such legends says that the court held in the town hall had condemned an innocent person to death. Later, the judges realized their mistake, but it was already too late. Since then, the legend says, a black coffin flies along the corridors of the town hall. It is a warning to those who have to make decisions in this building. Their decisions must be free of mistake. We don't know whether such an event really happened or whether it is just a legend. But the first page of the Lviv court book contains a phrase, "Remember the black coffin." Till the beginning of the 19th century, the building of the town hall remained almost unchanged. At that time, it consisted of 3 parts of different height built during the period between the 14th and the 17th centuries. The 14th of November 1826 was the last day of the medieval town hall. At 6:15, the old tower crashed down noisily. The trumpeter, 2 guards, and several workers died in the rubble. The building of a foundation of a new town hall began a year later. The trowel and the ceremonial pillow are symbols of this event. It took 8 years for the new town hall to be finished. The new building was considerably larger than the old one. It represented an Austrian style of architecture. At first, the citizens of Lviv did not like the new town hall. They called it a disgusting oven with a tall chimney. On the 2nd of November 1848, the Austrian artillery began to gunfire the market square. The tower resembled a torch on that day. The tower dome fell cracking down, then followed the clock and the bells. It took about a year to restore the tower hall. The top of the tower hall resembled medieval castles. When the reconstruction was finally complete, a Viennese clock was installed on the tower. This clock shows time till now. Its smaller bell counts the quadrants, the 15-minute intervals, while the bigger bell beats out hours. The inscription on the bell says, "Don't sleep, beware, because you don't know what time it is now," which means, don't sleep, because you will miss the kingdom of God. In 1918, the state flag was first installed on the tower of the town hall. It was the blue and yellow state banner. At the beginning of the 20th century, the town hall had 156 rooms and 9 halls. Besides the municipal authorities, the tower hall had residential apartments for the mayor, an archive, and a museum. Sometime later, the town hall was equipped with an elevator, because to get on top of the tower, one needs to walk over 400 steps. Unlike other public buildings in Lviv, the town hall has never changed its function. For many centuries, it has been the center of political and social life. Now the town hall continues to build the present and plan the future of Lviv, the town which recently celebrated its 750th anniversary. Science be cultivated in this brotherhood school in the future and survive in this borderline Rus land in the Rus Lviv. The church, or the temple of God, is a place of spiritual resort for each Christian. The Church of the Assumption, with a complex of surrounding buildings, has been such a temple of soul, as well as a cultural center for Lviv citizens, since the 16th century. For the Ukrainians who at that time were allowed to build houses only in one street in Lviv, the Ruska Street, this temple became a symbol of cultural and national autonomy within the boundaries of foreign and often hostile states. Earlier, this church was called Voloska. Back in those times, it was the name of the present Moldova. The Moldavian statesmen supported the Orthodox Ukrainians who lived in Lviv. They financed the building and the finishing of the church. Helped to purchase the copper for roofing and bells. The remains of the Moldavian Countesses Bernovsky, for instance, were kept in the church's vaults. The famous Cossacks leader, Ivan Pitkova, also found his last resort there. The Moscow Tsars also contributed to the building of the temple. The religious Russian Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich was one of the founders of the church. The Polish king, at the request of the Prince Konstantin Ostrowski, allowed to transport the materials for building of this church without payment of customs duties. As a gratitude for their charity, their emblems were installed below the dome of the church. The oldest building of the Assumption Brotherhood, preserved till our days, is the bell tower called the Tower of Kornyakt. The history of the building is dramatic. In fact, it was founded by the Ukrainian merchant David, who traded fish. However, the architect's design of the tower was wrong, and in 1570, when the building was almost complete, it crashed down. Overwhelmed with grief, David died. The laurels of the founder received a rich member of the Assumption Brotherhood, Konstantin Kornyakt, who was Greek by origin and Orthodox by religion. He was a wholesale merchant who came to Lviv from Crete. Soon, the king granted him control over all the customs points. Not long after, David became the richest man in the Apostolate and gave loans even to the king. His luxurious house on the market square is a unique example of the early Renaissance in Lviv. In 1572-1580, the Tower of Kornyakt was restored by the famous Lviv architect, Italian by origin, Pietro Barbone, who also designed the house of Kornyakt. At the end of the 17th century, another floor was added to the tower. Since then, its height, including the cross, has been 66 meters. At the same time, a small church was built. Later it was called the Chapel of Three Saints. The founder of the small church was a Greek whose name was Alexander Balaban. This is confirmed by the inscription in Greek over the entrance. The architect of the church was Andrei P.S.This from Rus. The church itself was built over 40 years by the Italian builders Pavlo Rimlyanin and his father-in-law Wojciech Kapinos. The construction was finished by Ambrosy Prechylny. The Assumption Brotherhood, as an organization of citizens grouped around the Church of the Assumption, appeared in the 15th century. We know the names of some of the first members: Volos, David Homa, and Stepan Dropan, who is considered to be the first Ukrainian printer. For a long time, the main activity of the Brotherhood was building, decoration, and maintenance of the church. This is no wonder. The church and the adjacent buildings were burned 4 times in the period between the 15th and 18th centuries. The golden age of cultural and educational movement of the Lviv Brotherhood was the period between the 16th and 17th centuries. The status of the Brotherhood made it independent from local clerical hierarchy. The Brotherhood was subordinate directly to the patriarchs. The Brotherhood defined its main task as the promotion of Orthodox religion and education. In order to be able to print books, the Brotherhood raised funds and bought the Ivan Fedorov's printing shop, which at that time was held by the Jews as a mortgage. From the 17th century to the beginning of the 20th century, the printing shop was continually operating near the Church of the Assumption, in the house of Mystsiv, occupying the northeastern corner of the residential area around the Church of the Assumption. It is symbolic that now in the building of former Staropehysky Institute there is a printing house which is now operated by the College of Printing. The Brotherhood published the books of religious and secular nature: Bibles, prayer books, grammar books, ABC books. On the whole, the Brotherhood has published over 1 million books. The Brotherhood members also included craftsmen and merchants such as the Rohatinsky brothers, Homa Babich, Lukasz Huba, Dmytro Krasovsky, Senko Lutsky. Later, the Brotherhood also included representatives of the Ukrainian nobility, Cossack chiefs, and even magnates. The level of education at the Brotherhood School was equal to that of the university. The children of wealthy citizens as well as poor youth studied there. To provide for their well-being, the Brotherhood raised donations while students themselves earned money by theatrical performances and singing carols at Christmas. The Metropolitan Petro Mohyla, famous lexicographer Pavlo Berinda, Cossacks' hetman Petro Konoshevich Sagaidatchny studied at the school. The former student of the Brotherhood School, Petro Konoshevich Sagaidatchny, willed to the Brotherhood a big sum of money in support of the Greek studies. This is how the Assumption Brotherhood looked like. Though the Tower of Kornyakt, which was the symbol of the Brotherhood, also has an interesting history. The Tower of Kornyakt was a bell tower with a famous big bell called Kirilo. The bell was 2 meters high and 2 meters wide. There was an anecdotic dispute about the bell between a Polish woman and a Russian woman. The dispute was solved by a future Lviv chronicler, Zymorovich, who ruled that the Polish woman should call this bell Mr. Kirilo. the bell also aroused a conflict between the Brotherhood and the Lviv Dominicans. The latter tried to prohibit the Rusyns, which was the name of the Ukrainians at that time, to ring the bell as its sound interfered with the conduct of the Catholic Mass. This time, the dispute was solved in favor of the Catholics. The tower was also used as a punishment cell. The famous Yurko Rohatinets was detained there. Besides, it served as an observation post and a platform for artillery. In 1648, during the encirclement of Lviv by Khmelnytsky, according to the historian Kripakevich, in order to vex the Ukrainians, the town council put Jews around the tower. In 1657, when Lviv was attacked by the Semigorod leader Rakotsi, the Brotherhood hid the jewelry into the church walls, with guards and gunners standing on the walls of the tower and on the tower itself. In later centuries, the Brotherhood experienced bad times. For a long time, the Brotherhood fought against the union with Rome. During the Austrian rule, the Brotherhood was reorganized into the Stavropighiysky Institute, and in the 19th century it became the outpost for supporters of Moscow. Finally, in 1939, the Brotherhood was liquidated by the first Soviets. Despite this, the Assumption Brotherhood will forever be remembered for its achievements in the fight for the Ukrainian language, religion, culture in the times when Ukraine was under the control of foreign states. This magnificent complex of the Church of the Assumption is the most distinct feature of the Ukrainian Lviv, the town with few Rusyns but a lot of Rus.